Welcome to the MLB Trade Rumors podcast, brought to you by MLBTradeRumors.com, the most timely and comprehensive source of hot stove news and rumors in the world. Here's your host, Jeff Todd.
With Korean shortstop Jung-Ho Kang currently in the middle of the posting process, I'm joined today by Ryan Sadowski of Global Sporting Integration. We're going to discuss player movement in both directions between Major League Baseball and the KBO. Ryan's a former pitcher with the Giants and in the Korea Baseball Organization, and he has a ton of insight on international transactions as well as several notable Korean players. First, of course, we'll run down the week's transactions.
Quick hits.
The Red Sox finalized the acquisition of pitcher Wade Miley from the Diamondbacks as both teams continue to turn over their rosters. The White Sox continued their aggressive offseason by signing Melky Cabrera to a 3-year, $42 million deal. Likewise, the Marlins have added another piece in Michael Morse, who figures to slot in at first base after signing for $16 million over the next 2 seasons. The Astros have embarked on a somewhat more modest acquisition program and have added Jed Lowry for $23 million over 3 years. The Yankees re-signed third baseman Chase Headley for $52 million over a 4-year term. The Royals addressed 2 needs by signing right fielder Alex Rios and starter Edinson Volquez, who gets 2 years and $20 million. The Indians also added a starter and right-hander Gavin Floyd. And several of the league's newest head baseball decision-makers have continued to remold their club's rosters. The Dodgers not only finalized their agreement with Brandon McCarthy, but added another high-upside starter in lefty Brett Anderson on a 1-year pact. Matt Joyce is headed from the Rays to the Angels in exchange for reliever Kevin Jepsen, and Joyce is not the only Tampa player going west. In one of the more interesting trades in recent memory, the Rays have reportedly agreed to ship Will Myers, the crown jewel of the James Shields trade, to the Padres in a 3-team deal that also includes the Nationals. In addition to Myers, San Diego will receive catcher Ryan Hanigan and 2 minor league arms from the Rays. The Rays will add backstop Rene Rivera, right-hander Burt Smith, and first base prospect Jake Bauers. Tampa did receive 2 other players from San Diego, righty Joe Ross and shortstop Trey Turner, both of whom were recent first-round draft picks. But those 2 players were flipped onto the Nationals in exchange for outfielder Steven Souza and young lefty Travis Ott.
Pull up a chair for today's Hot Stove Chat.
So I'm joined today by Ryan Sadowski. He works for a company called GSI Integration, and I'll let him tell you about that in a moment. But first of all, Ryan, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
If you don't recall, listeners, Ryan played for a number of years with the Giants organization, saw a bit of time in the big leagues, more recently played with the Lotte Giants in Korea, the KBO, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, Ryan, could you tell us first, I guess, what GSI does exactly?
GSI is a company that helps players make the transition from Asia to the States, and also players going from the States to Asia to make the cultural adaptation, the transition a bit more easy to handle.
And obviously you have a hands-on experience with that, having gone through it as a player yourself. What led you over to Korea in the first place, and what was that transition like for you?
My opportunity in the big leagues was fairly short, and I hit free agency and had been playing on minor league wages for 6.5 seasons and then on big league wages for a half a season. And the opportunity to play in Asia was there for me. And with the way baseball is structured now, a lot of the 4A guys, if you will, which I'll classify myself as that, have a difficult time sticking in the big leagues. And so their opportunity is much better to earn good wages over in Asia. So you're seeing a lot of really good young players go over to Asia nowadays.
Yeah, I think we've noticed a lot of those deals lately, and seems like nowadays there's also a larger component of sales of contract rights by the big league teams. Is that something that you've noticed? And I assume you work with a fair number of players that are going back and forth. Is that something where the player still has a good bit of say in whether they're going to go the other way or not?
Well, for the most part, it's always the player's final choice. There are very few agents that will push a player into going to where the money is at its best. But, for example, last year when I was creating lists for guys to go over to Asia, Josh Harrison was on my list. So he was probably that close to being a guy that was stuck in the middle of not sticking in the big leagues, and he has a big year and now he's an MVP candidate. So that's really where Asia is at. It's getting those middlemen that haven't been able to stick and run out of options and can't get a big league deal, and those teams are getting those guys like a Josh Harrison. In 2011, Andrew Miller's name came up because he was struggling with the Red Sox as a starter, and he had great stuff, and they thought, well, maybe this will transition in Asia. And Andrew Miller was probably not far away from being a guy that was approached for those jobs, the same as Harrison and the same as a lot of other guys.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I think it does show, to what extent opportunity plays a role, chance. Obviously, Harrison got a great opportunity this year. I look at a guy who actually was traded today, and Rene Rivera, who I think is 31 years old, and finally got a chance to play last year and had a huge season. Now, you also have, obviously, guys coming from Asia back over here, and from the perspective of MLB Trade Rumors and the transactional stuff that we cover, obviously that's most of where our focus is. The guy who's sort of on everyone's radar right now is Jungho Kang, and feel free to correct me if I'm butchering any of the Korean pronunciations, but
that might have been the best. Anybody who wants to pronounce it correctly, that was about as good as it gets.
I may just stop there and not try to pronounce any more, but I appreciate that. But Kang is a guy who hit a huge number of home runs and plays shortstop, and you almost don't have to say anything more than that to understand why there's a lot of interest in him. As someone who I'm sure is very familiar with Kang and the overall Korean game, what are your sort of general thoughts about him and what sort of player he'll be at the major league level?
Well, first of all, Kang's not, he hit 40 home runs in 128 games, so that translates into 51 home runs in a 162-game season. He's not going to hit 51 home runs next year in the big leagues. That's pretty safe to say. Now, that being said, the guy has power. The raw tools are there. He has power. He has pretty good bat speed. He has strong wrists. He has a strong enough arm to play there. He has some fundamental issues defensively, some that some people may think can be corrected. But if you wanted to grade him out from raw tools, you're looking at a guy that has major league tools to play in the big leagues.
No, and he's still relatively young. He's 27, which is the same age as, Rusney Castillo, who the Red Sox signed and gave a lot of money to. Doesn't have maybe a lot of projection left, but is still in that sort of prime territory. For teams buying him, or looking to buy his rights, do you see him as a shortstop? I mean, should he be treated that way by big league clubs, or do you think that he's more likely to end up playing somewhere else, whether it be third, second, or even the corner outfield or something?
I think that he probably will move, but to give him the opportunity to play shortstop, if a team wants, when a team bids on him, they control his negotiation rights, and to give him a little bit of time to develop, even though he's 27 years old, it's really not a time to develop. It's more of a time to evaluate. Teams in the States spend very little money on on scouting in Korea, and I think that probably leads to a few more unknowns. They don't really put the time and the resources necessary, and then on top of that, they feel like they can bring a guy over and probably give him a look to evaluate him there. I mean, they can see the raw tools are there, but to see if it's going to translate, I think it's going to be tough to say if he can really play shortstop. His arm can play, that's really clear, but he plays on turf. He tends to sit back on balls, and it's a question of whether he chooses to sit back on balls or whether he's not able to come up and get balls. And if he can be taught to come up and get balls. He's thick on the lower half. I've said that a bunch of times. Like, he's really a stocky 6-footer, if you will. And so the question becomes, how much range is he going to have? Is he going to lose range? And then if he has to go 2 or 3 steps to his right, his average arm is going to be a tough throw for him to make that real long throw in the 6-hole. So I think some of that's going to have to be evaluated once he gets here to the States. But raw tools-wise, he has the ability to stay in the infield. It's just a matter. The question is can he play shortstop, and that's where it gets tricky.
Sure, and it sounds like, I guess, there's some reasonable risk, but, that's always going to be the case unless you're dealing with a guy who's a pure athlete, a pure defender, in which case you may not have those kinds of power numbers. But turning to that question then, let's assume he does have to move off of shortstop or whether or not he does. When we talk about translating the power, like you said, obviously 50 home runs is extremely unrealistic, and I doubt anyone would suggest that. But do you look at him as the type of guy over a full big league season who's, a 12 to 15 home run guy, or a 15 to 20 home run guy, or even more? How do you view him?
It depends on where he gets put in the order. If he gets put around guys where he has to see pitches, he has raw power to hit 20 homers. I mean, he has 50 power for sure. It's just when he was in Korea, he was surrounded by two of the best hitters in the KBO, and so that meant that he had to be pitched to, and so did the guy behind him, and that creates him seeing a lot more pitches. And a lot of the home runs that he hit off of were off of foreign players or the top pitchers in the KBO. Now, granted, they don't compare with, a front-line starter, but you're looking at guys that are probably 4 or 5 starters in the big leagues that he's facing that he's still hitting home runs off of. But if you have to throw him in a weak lineup where, you can make your toughest pitches to him, it may not translate. I think he's a mistake hitter. Now, if you put him in the 7-hole of a good lineup where he's got some protection hitting around him and he gets some pitches, then he definitely has the power potential to hit 20 home runs.
Now, obviously, you've taken a good look at him. You obviously have experience with preparing to face batters. Do you see any areas where you as a pitcher, would approach him in a way that you think big league pitchers will be able to exploit?
Yeah, you can speed him up and slow him down. Even with a guy like myself who wasn't an incredibly hard thrower, I was 88 to 92. If I would slow him down, I could throw a ball above his bat if I got it in enough, and I could throw a breaking ball down in a way once I had him sped up to a fastball, and he would chase. But he hit mistakes. I mean, I fell behind him, and he hit the ball hard consistently. If you have to throw him strikes, he makes you pay. And I'm sure, he faced guys like Rahadimus Liz, who threw 100 miles an hour, and he faced Denny Batista, who was a guy that had, below average command, but the guy threw 96, 97 miles an hour, and he faced Seung-Hwan Oh throwing 97 with 92 mile an hour cutter, and he would run into pitches if they fell behind him and made mistakes. If you get ahead of him and you make your pitches, he's probably no different than a lot of other 7-hole hitters in the big leagues, which is you can get him out.
So all that being said, it seems like he's a guy who has some variability. He has some obvious clear upside. What do you see, whether from your perspective, your own opinion, or from the perspective of what the market will bear, what kind of a posting fee and what kind of a contract do you think it's going to require for a big league club to land him?
The posting fee is really tricky, and I wrote an article not too long ago that said the posting fee will be somewhere between $6 and $9 million. And the reason why I broke that down is where he fits in with tools and addressing some of the teams that had needs. And, there's been a lot of movement that has happened even in the last 2 weeks since I wrote that article. But there's still teams out there that have a need, and with a 27-year-old shortstop, you're buying out his prime years. So that where it really becomes tricky is if you see him as an everyday infielder or if you see him as Daniel Descalso, which, the Cardinals didn't pick up their 4th best infielder and grant him arbitration. He just signed with the Rockies. And, those are the type of guys that end up going back going overseas. So if a team sees him as an everyday infielder, I think somebody is going to go out there and have a glaring need and say, we're willing to take this risk. It's not the risk of, taking on a 6-year, $155 million John Lester deal. You're probably looking at spending somewhere in the $20 million range on this guy for his prime years. And, you can see the upside is there if it happens. And And if it doesn't happen, then, you don't mortgage your whole team on a guy like that. So, in year 5 and 6 of John Lester's deal, I think he'll be 37 and 38. So, some of those numbers become pretty tricky when it comes down to it. But, logically speaking, if there's a team that wants to take a risk on the upside and there's a team that wants to sign him, then you're probably looking somewhere between $6 and $9 million. Now, if there's a team that wants to block him, like Iwakuma with the A's a few years back, then, you might see a bid of $12 or $15 million, but all that means is that Kong's going to end up staying in Korea.
Now, we've also seen a couple of other guys, a couple of pitchers who were posted and end up doing just that, like you said, staying in Korea. And I'm going to give my best of the names, but Hyunjong Yang and Kwang Young Kim. And Yang was the guy who, I guess there was some debate over whether the Rangers or Twins had made the high bid, but that bid was not accepted. And Kim, the Padres bid was accepted, but they didn't reach a deal. With those two guys, are they pitchers who are undervalued by the big leagues? Or was the value, the value placed on them, which didn't get deals done, do you think that was correct?
Let's talk about Young first, because it's really hard to know what he even posted for. Nobody really even knows who won the bid or if any bid was actually made, which is the craziest thing of anything. But Young is a guy that, has a lot of delivery flaws. He's had a lot of injuries, and really he's only had 2 good seasons in the KBO. But when he did pitch well, he pitched pretty well. He showed pretty good stuff. But even at his peak, you were looking at probably a number 5 Major League starter, and an unproven number 5 Major League starter is, those are the guys nowadays in Major League Baseball that they're hoping they can get, 130 innings out of for 2 years and then not grant him arbitration. And then you've got Dustin Nippert that goes to play for the Doosan Bears and has 3 great years for the Doosan Bears. I mean, that's the type of guy that Young is. So I just don't think that fits into a lot of teams' formulas nowadays, where you've got a fringy number 5 starter if you're going to want to give this guy a major league deal. Kim was a little bit trickier because Kim had a stroke in the off-season of 2011 and the off-season of 2012. Prior to having the stroke, he was Hyunjin Ryu, 1.2, however you want to say it. The guy had electric stuff. And he has shown signs of having stuff like that recently, but he's also shown he's just not as consistent. The command isn't there. The third pitch isn't quite there. But you do see, he kills left-handed hitters in Korea. Guys hit like 140 off of him from the left side, or 150. The numbers are not pretty when, you're a left-handed hitter going up there and hitting off of Kim. So I wonder how much the Padres with the new front office saw him and how they were addressing it, because I had heard that they were going to try him out as a starter and then move him to the pen, or were they really going to see him as a left-handed specialist? Because most left-handed specialists, unless you're Javier Lopez or Andrew Miller, those guys are the same thing as Young. They're the guys that are playing for major league minimums, so giving those guys a major league deal just isn't in the formula for a lot of teams.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a major element here. Like you said, not a lot of money put into the scouting, and it's certainly a lot different than having a guy who your scouts have been watching, especially if they play for your team, and having all of that inside information that's developed from players that have been in minor league systems. I guess last year we saw another pitcher come over and kind of had his moment of expectation, came over and didn't have a great year in AAA, and that's Seokmin Yoon, who signed with the Orioles. Where would you kind of put him in that ballpark in terms of what your expectations were for him and how you think he looks moving forward?
Yoon was a guy that I actually wrote a scouting report on that I released publicly right as he signed, and I said that this guy is not going to have the stuff to be a starter, and he was a one-inning reliever. Yoon's got a wipeout slider. It's a hard, you're looking at like an 87, 89 mile an hour slider when it's going good, and it was going good at Le Pen the second half of the year in Korea. So they took a guy that was moved from the bullpen, from the starting role to the bullpen in Korea. They brought him to the States and moved him back to a starting role, and it just never happened. Nothing really went well, and I'm sure it was discouraging for him to go to AAA where he thought he was probably, a call away. He gets banged around his first few starts and then gets a little buried. If I don't know if there's a better term for that, but with Baltimore doing well, they're not going to give a guy that is struggling in AAA and has never proven himself in the big leagues a shot to pitch in the big leagues. And that's where Yoon ended up. I really hope that a team, or if he's with Baltimore still this year, that they put him in a spot where he can be successful. And the fastball, even though in Korea, even at times when he was throwing at 92, 94 miles an hour, it still got banged like it was 86, 87. It just never played up to the velocity that he was throwing it to. And last year he went through a period of dead arm, and he struggled with just the adjustment phase of it. One of my good friends played with him, said he's a great guy in the clubhouse, but just had a really difficult time understanding what was going on. And that's tough. I mean, coming from Asia as a 27-year-old guy and trying to get a grasp of what's happening, it's not the same as coming from a Latin American country where the cultures are much more similar. That's Western European culture that's translating, whereas if you look at Confucian culture, it's a major, major difference.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I wonder, you can obviously speak to this. To what extent is there, in terms of the transition from the States to Asia or vice versa, if you're coming from the United States to Asia, teams have a limited number of slots. You're expected to be a good player, and very often a lot of the American players are quite good and quite productive. Whereas coming the other way, obviously, you're entering what's generally a higher level of play. The best players from the entire world, play in the big leagues for the most part. To what extent does that aspect, play a role in the transitioning and really what you do with GSI, I guess?
Well, actually, what you just said is a common misconception when it comes to players going to Korea. Only 30% of players that go from the States to Korea that are foreigners last for more than one full season. 70% of guys do not handle the transition well and cannot perform at that level, because a lot of it has to do with the transition, and some of it does have to do with guys just aren't as talented as they once were when they played in the States. So I think it's a common perception that a lot of the players that go from the States to Asia go there and thrive, when 70% of them don't last more than a year. And a lot of that has to do with the cultural thing. And I think when guys go from Asia to the States and they don't do well, it's simply because the level of baseball isn't there. And that is probably a misconception as well. I mean, there are some guys like Hyunjin Ryu who are so good and just so talented, or a guy like Yu Darvish or Hideo Nomo who are just freakishly good. Those are your guys that roll out of bed and are your stars. And then there are your other guys who are your middle of the rotation guys, your back of the rotation guys, your 7-hole hitters that need to grasp the changes that go around. Kong took a while to develop in Korea. You could always see the tools were there, but he had to grow and mature. And when I saw him at age 21, he was a lot different than, at age 24. And now that he's going to be age 27, he's going to be even more mature, but he's still going to have to make that transition. So I think if a lot of fans understood that 70% of the guys that go to Korea don't perform well from the States, they probably wouldn't have the expectation that more than 30% of guys coming from Korea to the States would have a successful time, just simply because of the culture.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I certainly appreciate you, correcting my own misconception, because that's certainly what it was. Now, another guy I wanted to ask you about, I think you actually may have mentioned, not by name, but you mentioned a teammate of Kong who, surrounding him in the lineup, and the guy I was thinking of is Byung-ho Park. I think hit 52 home runs, which was, whether or not the home run numbers were inflated, was significantly above league average last year. Is he or any other guy like him, coming up, who is going to be this time next year someone we're talking about?
Last year, I wrote up a player named Seung-Hwan Oh, who was a free agent and signed a 2-year, $7.5 million deal to play for the Hanshin Tigers. And he was actually the number one guy on my list. He's a closer, and he'll be a free agent after next season. So he's a Korean guy playing in Japan, and his numbers in Japan last year were actually better than his numbers were the previous season in Korea. Especially if you look at his peripheral stats. I think his ERA was virtually the same. But O is the guy that I was speaking of that's, 95 to 97 with a 91 mile an hour cutter. And he's a stockier guy, not real tall, has a hitch like Rob Nen used to have, where his foot would touch and then he would throw. And the ball just explodes out of his hand. And I was really, I'll say disappointed. I was disappointed that he signed so early because I thought he could come over here and be a really impact closer in the big leagues. Now he'll be 33 years old or 32 years old next year. So, that's when velocities start to go down and, he might be at the end. I think big leagues lost 2 years of a spectacular closer type pitcher, especially in an age where back of the bullpen help is so necessary. But O is a guy that, I think Korean fans really appreciated, just if you would, an Eric Gagne of his time in Korea. So he'll be available next year, but I don't know if he'll quite have as much in the tank or be quite as high valued as he would have been 2 years ago if the attention would have been focused on him. And then, you can talk about Park. Park kind of has that raw power like a Mike Napoli where he swings and misses a ton. But at the same time, when he hits balls, there's no doubt about it. I mean, he'll hit them as far as anybody. And, hitting around Kong benefited both of those two guys. Park is a guy that, short arms, kind of got those velociraptor type arms where he can get his hands inside of a ball and just launch them. And if those two guys hit balls, it comes off the bat different. And I think if Kong's power plays out just to a point where he hits 15, 20 home runs, Park's got more power. That's the only thing that you can be sure of. I mean, he's a first baseman. He doesn't move real well. He's stuck at first base. I mean, he's not going anywhere. And so I think a lot of the answers on Park are going to come from Kong. And if Kong's power plays out to a point, then that Parks, will surpass that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Especially I think seeing how Kong does translate seems fairly likely that he will end up playing in the States and he will set down an interesting marker. One more thing I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned Seung-Hwan Oh, going over to Japan. I just managed to pop up his stats and I see, nearly 11 K per nine, under 2 walks per 9. And it brings to mind a guy who I wanted to ask you about who has a similar high strikeout, low walk profile. And it's a guy that you played with in the Giants organization and who reportedly agreed to terms to re-sign with the Giants. And it's Sergio Romo. And really what I wanted to ask you about is, having played with him and having gone through a long career yourself, being in the business now of helping players transition often at a time near, somewhat towards the end of their career. How do you see him as a bet going forward? He got a 2-year deal and $15 million. What's it going to be like for him, for the Giants, managing to stay productive into his mid-30s?
The last thing usually to go on, guys, is command. And Sergio Romo has 80 or had 80 command. It might be 75 now. I mean, when we're talking about command, that guy's command was and probably still is just about as good as anybody's in the big leagues. So when it comes to signing him for an extra 2 years, as long as he was healthy, I don't think that the Giants were terribly concerned about the age as much with a guy like Sergio, simply because what's the difference between a 45 fastball and a 40? 88, 87? I mean, we're not talking about a big difference. He never beat guys with velocity. So, and in the second half, you saw him command the ball better. He struggled with command this first half this year, and he paid for it. And he left some sliders over the middle of the plate and got into counts where guys could sit on pitches. And once he started getting that command back and started looking like 80 command again, and maybe it wasn't quite an 80 this year, but command, like I said, is usually the last thing to go. assuming he's healthy, and I'm sure that if the Giants signed him, they feel confident that he is healthy. And so you've got a guy with 80 command. Maybe he's losing a tick on his fastball. The slider, the slider's still the slider. It doesn't look like it does all that much on TV, except for he throws it on a funny angle, and when you watch him from the back, and there's 100 guys that look like they throw sliders like that. What he does is he commands it so well, and he confuses guys with it. And honestly, I think it's probably best for him to be thrown to a guy like Buster, who knows how Sergio wants to pitch. And, he had the benefit of going from Bengie Molina to Buster Posey. And, me throwing to Bengie, and then at the end of my time in the States, I threw to Buster a little bit. There aren't too many guys that have a better baseball mind than that. And Sergio's a guy that if you know Sergio off the field, he's not going to shake too many guys off. He's going to trust guys what they want to do, and that's why he's been successful. The only comparison that you can have to Sergio Romo and Sing-Hwan Oh is that they're both great relief pitchers. Other than that, they're two totally different approaches, personalities, stuff. I mean, they couldn't be more different except for they can get the last 3 outs of the game.
Well, Ryan, it's all just really fascinating stuff, and these are all, of course, types of things that really outsiders like myself would never get to hear otherwise. I really appreciate your time, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much to Ryan for being so generous with his time. One programming note. We're not going to come to you on the next 2 regularly scheduled podcast dates, because those would fall on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. Rather than trying to draw you away from presents and punch to listen to me talk, we're going to wait until January 8th of the new year. In the meantime, happy holidays, and thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Remember to visit MLBTradeRumors.com and follow us on Twitter at MLB Trade Rumors for all the latest news and rumors from around the game.